arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it. Because it's also been affirmed. Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you since you're...
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us to, what are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission, and I am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed, because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today, so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the Freedom Clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but
this is the moment where the hearing quietly shifts from routine oversight into something much more uncomfortable. Notice what just happened. The senator asked a direct, binary question. If hundreds of people may have been denied due process, will the FBI investigate? And instead of a clear yes or no, the answer immediately moves into institutional distance. It's not for me to call the balls and strikes. That phrasing matters, because the FBI director isn't being asked to rule on a Supreme Court case. He's being asked whether potential constitutional violations deserve investigation. Viewers should pause here and ask themselves, when the nation's top law enforcement agency hesitates to even evaluate a possible violation of the Constitution, what message does that send about accountability?
an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says
doesn't
no person.
say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status. The Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you since you're...
By the time this exchange ends, what we've really witnessed is not just a policy disagreement. It's a clash over responsibility. Throughout the hearing, Senator Merkley keeps returning to one simple principle: the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process. Not a complicated legal theory, not an obscure technical rule, just the plain text that says no person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And Merkley's argument is straightforward. If people were detained and sent out of the country without that process, then at minimum it raises the question of whether the Constitution was violated. What makes the moment so revealing is the way Director Patel responds. Again and again, the answer shifts away from the substance of the question and toward procedural distance. It's framed as a constitutional debate. It's framed as something for courts to decide. It's framed as an issue belonging to another agency. But the senator keeps pulling the conversation back to the same point. If a law may have been broken, and if constitutional rights may have been ignored, shouldn't the nation's premier investigative agency at least examine it? And that tension is what changes the temperature of the room. Because in democratic systems, accountability doesn't only depend on written laws. It depends on institutions being willing to enforce them. When officials begin treating constitutional protections as someone else's problem or something that requires academic debate before action, public trust starts to erode. Not because people expect every official to have every answer, but because they expect those officials to take the oath they swore seriously. Another striking moment comes when the senator points to the actual wording of the Constitution: no person. That phrase has been interpreted for decades by courts as applying broadly, not just to citizens. Whether someone agrees with the policy outcomes or not, that legal foundation is part of the system the government operates under. And Merkley's frustration seems to come from what he sees as a basic disconnect. A top law enforcement official claiming uncertainty about a principle the courts have repeatedly addressed. Now, supporters of Patel might argue that he's being cautious, that he's trying not to prejudge legal matters outside the FBI's jurisdiction. And in fairness, bureaucratic boundaries between agencies are real. But the exchange shows why those boundaries can become controversial when constitutional rights are involved. If every agency says the responsibility belongs somewhere else, the question becomes, who actually steps in when potential violations occur? That's the larger issue this hearing raises. It's not just about deportations. It's not just about one agency or one official. It's about whether the protections written into the Constitution are treated as active safeguards or as theoretical principles that only matter once a court forces the issue. And that's why this moment resonated beyond the hearing room. Because when a senator presses a witness on the meaning of due process, he's really asking a deeper question. When power is exercised, who ensures the rules are followed? Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the director's response was a reasonable caution about legal jurisdiction? Or do you think the senator exposed a real accountability gap inside the system? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who cares about constitutional issues, and subscribe for more deep dive political analysis just like this.